if you are working on something and it's not working, so I advise entrepreneurs to, work on the business in 90-day sprints, right? And you can't seem to get the traction up, first 90 days. By the time you get into the fourth month and you don't have results, find help, right? Um, the idea of entrepreneurship is evolving to the point that you understand what is required. So the smart thing sometimes is to ask for help. The smart thing is to get a second opinion. It's not that you have to figure it out, right? You need to get to a place where you can identify that this is either above you or this is beyond you, and you start to identify who could solve that problem. And when you do that, you're the smart person in the room.
Hey, welcome to the Grow Up Podcast with Joe Mutuku. My name is Joe Mutuku, and welcome to this podcast. Our aim here is to promote conversations that influence founders and leaders into understanding their own value and growing it through enterprise. I hope you join us. Feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and also ring the bell so that you get notified when we upload a new video. All right. So now let's get on to the video. Minutes. We have a structure, but we don't have to stick to it. It's just to guide us, but generally it's just to hear your wisdom on business strategy. All right, so I'm gonna introduce you, which I would say I am very, very impressed about what you've been able to do for yourself and in business. I was going through your LinkedIn and seeing all the amazing things that you've done. Like right now, you're a senior partner at Lighthouse Capital. You're a senior partner and investment officer at Tactive, and you've been a COO of Wowzy, Adrian Soko. A lot of amazing, brilliant businesses, right? You've been a business coach, still are. I think you're probably one of the most impactful business coach me and my partner Jim ever had. So that says a lot about you. And you've been a mentor, strategic consultant to a lot of really great businesses like Zetova, Crystal Tours, Zellerman, Enda, B Lab. So yeah, I think people who don't know who you are, I think this will be a good place to introduce yourself. So guys, the person I'm talking about today his name is Kaye Matereke. His full name is Kotsanai Matereke. Such an
That's
amazing,
correct.
brilliant man. He's from Zimbabwe. I know there are a lot of people that actually follow me that are from Zimbabwe, so I think this is gonna be interesting to hear. He's got a lot of wisdom to share as far as business strategy is concerned. Like I mentioned, he is the founder and also the senior partner of Tactive, which is an organization that works with small businesses to help them grow and scale. So if you are an entrepreneur that feels that you really need help, that would be a good place to start. Just go to tactive.consulting and you'll get to meet these guys and they'll help you. All right. So, okay, it's very difficult to introduce you without, I guess, telling the story of how we met. I think we met by accident. Um,
Yeah.
I was meeting you. I wasn't even supposed to be there. I wasn't even supposed to be there in a meeting that you were having, and then I ended up showing you what we do, and from there we just started a conversation, and then you helped us realize that we had a lot of gaps in our business. We had a good product, but we didn't know how to position it properly. We didn't know how to we didn't know, basically there are a lot of stuff that we didn't know that you were able to help us do. So welcome, first of all. Welcome
Thank
to the
you.
podcast. And for those people that maybe don't know you or haven't heard of you, how would you introduce yourself?
Okay. So, first of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity. I think any opportunity to speak is oftentimes an honor. And it always gets you to think about what you're going to say, which sometimes is not a constant state when you're going through life, right? You're always going somewhere, you're always trying to do something, and sometimes you don't have time to reflect around what's important so that you can actually pivot or frame correctly. My name, as you said, is Kotsanai. Everyone calls me Kaye. And I am someone who, grew up sort of in an environment where there was like massive inflation. So I know everyone sort of thinks about inflation in single digits or double digits. I grew up in an environment with six digits, right? And
Wow.
what happened when I was younger was you would see sort of the price of bread change so fast, and you would be in a queue hoping to buy some bread. It runs out, and it always leaves you with a question: what could I have done, you know, in this short space of time that would have created enough value for me to, actually afford to buy that bread? And very maybe disempowering when I was younger, but it actually allowed me to start to appreciate the reality of an economy and actually realizing the opportunities that exist for businesses. So I started, spending more time trying to learn how to make things work. So coming from a country that was struggling economically, when I went to South Africa and I worked around sort of sub-Saharan Africa until I started working more dominantly in Kenya, I was looking for an opportunity to actually just apply myself in a way that was like meaningful. And one may call me an entrepreneur. I've been part of multiple founding teams. It's easy to come up with an idea, much harder to make it work. And I think I then started to appreciate the opportunity to learn from my own mistakes and then turn those into lessons. And so I like to introduce myself as a business coach because I'm consistently talking about, so let's stop and reflect. Let's think about what we're about to do before we do it. And that's where the most insight comes from. I do play active roles in a couple of businesses. And in these businesses, again, I am trying to solve market problems, but I'm also trying to learn with teams around what's important. Like when you have a lot of chaos around you, you still need to be still and figure out what's important and what's not important so that you invest your effort where you get the best return. And so I find myself again in that sort of coaching, training, reflective state, which I, get a lot of value from. Um, I have a business background. I've been an entrepreneur. I more now, leaning into investments because we started from trying to build ideas, and we've had, significant success in scaling businesses that are Africa based into the globe. And I'm now starting to see the value of the investor hat in thinking about the growth of businesses, right? So, moved from being a team player into management or into an executive role, moving from that to now being the investor in another business so that I could have a very holistic view of how to support businesses in the environment that we're in. Being a senior partner at Tactive also gives me an opportunity to interact with policymakers. So I'm now speaking to governments and I'm speaking to leaders in development to help them understand basically what the challenges are for startups or for businesses in different ecosystems so they can help build infrastructure that supports scalability. So in a nutshell, I want to be a lifetime learner, and then I want to help
Wow.
others build infrastructure that will make entrepreneurs successful.
Wow. first of all, that's insane, right? Um, Being able to um, grow to the scale that you have, where you're even getting involved with policymakers and governments, and I think when I met you, that felt that it was something that was really important to you, working with entrepreneurs and trying to figure out how you can be of service to them. And I feel like being at the place where you are now, even working with policymakers, you were able to bring the change or the help people, entrepreneurs, and governments, and even people that are trying to grow and scale. Uh, you're able to make that happen for them. So I think that's pretty cool. Um, so it sounds to me like basically your strategic thinking has gotten you a lot of success. Um, so where does that come from? Like, how did you end up being the person that thinks about stuff deeply and asks the right questions to be able to help businesses grow? Like, where does that come from?
I think sometimes it actually comes from maybe part of it is a little bit DNA. My dad was a mechanical engineer, and like I used to see this guy become
Wow.
so happy every time he fixed a car. So if he got a car and it wasn't working or it was sounding wrong, and then he would spend hours working on it, and then at the end he would pretty much get up from underneath the car, turn it on, and then the sound would just tell him that everything is okay. And so now I have like this fascination. I've got a really deep fascination with engines, and it doesn't matter whether it's a motorcycle, a
Mm.
car, or plane, like just that sound and understanding that the architecture that's behind that, the force, the power, the design is just so intentional. And I feel like I inherited some of that. So when I get into a space, I'm really trying to ask questions about limitations. I'm trying to understand constraints. I don't oftentimes lead with a solution, because I think sometimes, and this is something that happens with entrepreneurs, like we care about an industry or a particular space, right? And then what we begin to do immediately is start to build a product. And then once we've built out this complex product, we've invested time and money in packaging it, we then take it to a market and then nobody responds. We know it's worth something because of the effort and the expertise that we've put into it, but oftentimes it's not fit for purpose, right? And I sort of take the approach where I come into a space and I admit I know nothing, and I start a journey of learning. What are the needs in this particular space? What does this community or group of people really want? What are they willing to pay for if it was delivered? And then I start to gather a group of people who have these competencies and then say, hey, could we build a product for this group of people? I think problem solving for me maybe comes more naturally, but I think it's really sometimes more approach of being less interested in what you want to do and really thinking about the idea that every entrepreneur is trying to serve others. And if you can embrace that framing, I think your ability to design and build products will then complement sort of the environment that there is a customer who is happy to receive it and willing to pay for it. And I think that just that curiosity is one part, but the other part is just like consciously framing that your job is service. And so you can't lead by saying, this is how I would like to serve you. You actually have to understand
Wow.
what people need, then say, because of my skill, right, I will be able to deliver something that meets your needs and potentially even surpasses your expectations.
Whew. Oh my gosh. That's it almost sounds like it's obvious, but it's not, right? Like you said, it's almost true to say that when you're in business, you're serving, right? Based on what you've said, and you, I guess, can't afford to not be a listener or a good listener, especially if you're trying to serve someone. So
That's right.
and it sounds to me, um if you're trying to give people things without listening to them and letting them tell you what they need, you kind of always have this friction point where it's almost like you're giving them something and they're resisting it because they see that you really don't understand what it is that they want and need. And so you're frustrated because you can't scale. They're frustrated because you're a nuisance instead of being someone that is valuable. But I will say that it sounds like it's something people should know, but a lot of people don't know that, because I know that we, myself included, we've been a part of that, where we build something all the way to the end and then you go to the market and nobody wants it. Um, and then I guess what we learned from you is that first listen to what the market wants, and then you can build it later. Once you know that there's a market for it, then you can improve it. But if you don't if you don't listen to the market or listen to who it is that you're trying to serve, then you're always gonna have that friction point. So would you say that that is like a principle, or would you say that that is pretty much obvious for any business that's trying to scale?
So, I mean, it's not obvious because, like, I think all of us have an ego, and the
Mm-hmm.
ego sort of reinforces our confidence to do things. So we
Mm-hmm.
walk around, telling ourselves a narrative. I am either the best at this particular task. If somebody gave it to me, I would do an incredible job. And I think because of that, like, it's a necessary component to apply yourself. Like, everyone needs a positive reinforcement, but the challenge is that sometimes what customers need is not what you have. And the filter that I am the best for it then limits you to actually hear and understand what customers need. And I think fundamentally the idea of innovation is really, the ability to respond to a need in a way that's relevant. I always, when I'm working with manufacturing companies, I always talk about like paper-based solutions. Everyone is very, quick to suggest a high-tech solution. Why don't we get an ERP? Why don't we plug into some AI and big data to solve the problem?
Oh.
And I say to them, okay, like, I understand the value of technology and scalability, but if you fundamentally get the problem wrong, it doesn't matter how much tech you throw at this thing, it will still fail, because maybe the dysfunction is the lack of a conversation. The dysfunction is a lack of empathy, or the idea that there's a dysfunctional culture. And when we add a solution that we think controls or addresses the problem without understanding the underlying cause, we naturally set ourselves up for failure. So what I challenge entrepreneurs to do is just like, stay humble. Like, try to understand what the need is as an observer, not always as the person to provide the solution. Because what you want to hear is, you want to hear clearly, you want to get past your cognitive bias so that you really understand what customers want, how much they're willing to pay for it, and if you invested your time, would there be a good product market fit? And if you can't get through these three questions effectively, you're going to hear what you need to hear, and then you're going to jump to create the solution, and then come back and realize that no one's willing to pay for it. And it's only the dysfunction around the initial, engagement, the idea that you're willing to learn and also accept that you might not be the best person to solve it, or you're willing to learn what is needed and then not try force fit what you're capable of doing, but now learn how you can build value for that particular customer, and that is the journey. So that open-mindedness is very critical for us to get to solutions. I want to highlight another part of this is when we're building businesses, like maybe let's go back to the macros, right? I always say like listening to a customer sounds very fluffy. You know, it's just like you need to be a good listener. And you're just like, I've been told that my whole life, you know, and it hasn't really worked out. Nobody actually cares, right? But when we think about like demand curves, right? The demand of something exists because there's a fundamental need. So when we see massive adoption of a product pretty much overnight, whether we're looking at tech products or lifestyle products, it means that there was someone with a fundamental need, someone took time to understand, and then they started to propose solutions, and then we sort of see the curve really pick up. That adoption is the right response to a need. When you're bringing a product to a market and no one's buying, that's a listening problem, right? And it could be a good product. So going back to the idea of product market fit, it could be a need for, tweaking, adjusting. And unless you're willing to be very, experimental, um, listen, try to reconfigure, sometimes it's very difficult to actually end up with the outcome that you want. And I always think of it as markets are true. If something is great, people will buy. If people don't buy, you can say your tech or your solution is futuristic, and maybe one day people will get it. It still tells you that product market fit, we still haven't cracked it. Maybe we'll crack it a little later. But whatever the response is by a market, it's very indicative of acceptance or just adoption, which is like super critical. The second, maybe big idea that I would like to share with people in the space is that oftentimes you are going to fail maybe 90% of the time, right? And it's a question about how do you pick up, you know, and build on the 10% that was correct. So you had an assumption. So, Joe, let's talk about your business. And then you said, okay, branding and communication is important to people. Everybody should take it seriously. And pretty much the world still doesn't take it seriously, right? But
Mhm.
your intuition is probably 10% correct, and your delivery is probably 90% wrong. So when you have that 10%, you need to figure out what insights do I learn from every failed case? Is it the way we communicated? Is it how we package the product? Is it the pricing? And you almost have to go through this iterative cycle of testing, a number of ideas, and then you start to see some spikes in terms of interest, right? And then that incrementally
Mhm.
creates another 2%, another 5%, another 10%. And before you know it, you start to build an evidence based business model based on validated data. And then you have something. So when you start and you sort of fall flat on your face, that's okay. You just need to make sure every single time you do that, you find the lesson. If you don't find the lesson, you will learn very quickly how expensive it is to keep failing.
Wow. Um, so it's almost like you're saying it is crucial for every business to be open-minded, I guess, and innovative, and not really be hung up on an idea, which, as you said, could be 90% wrong. So what you're saying is, yes, have the idea, but be flexible on how that idea um, can be expanded upon through more the response of the market, right? So you put your idea into the world, and then nobody said anything. So that already is a response. So if you still went back and put the same idea out there, so it would mean that you should expect the same response. So basically, what you're saying is, as an entrepreneur, you can't afford to not be flexible. Is that what you're saying? And in what you believe to be true, and also how you believe that it should be expressed into the world or into the market. Is that true?
Yeah, 100%. The only time you know you're right is when you're getting paid.
Mhm.
The moment payments stop.
Yeah.
I was coaching this group of people, just a young group of people, and we're talking about this idea of solving fundamental problems, because the other part of like building a great business is really identifying a real need, right? And sometimes we make assumptions and then we sort of run with them. And I was trying to get them to really reflect on sort of Bill Gates, right? And how Bill Gates used technology to shape how we now experience what we call work, right? And, his status as a billionaire is obvious because for every single unit he sold that was above a billion, that created economic value. It sustains the value that he gains as a person or as a trust, right? Because of the problem that he solved. And I think sometimes we choose to pick the idea of solving problems that are short term, things that are like quick fixes, and we don't take time to actually say what would move the needle for humanity. And that's a grand question. What would move the needle for industry? you know and within your capacity you start to wrestle with a real problem that oftentimes you do not have answers to. But I believe that's where you unlock the most value. And until we scale the problems that we want to address, and over time gather courage to solve those particular problems, sometimes the benefit that we expect to get from businesses never shows up because the problem is too small, right? It's either people are not willing to pay us, or when we solve it, what we earn is not enough to keep us in business for a lifetime. So you want to pick problems that really move the needle, or problems that will take a lifetime to address, because when you figure it out, you will be 10 steps ahead of market every single time. I'm sure when Elon Musk started talking about going into space, everyone else was like, nah, that doesn't really make any sense. It's a little dreamy, et cetera, et cetera. 10 years later, there's a whole industry in billions that now everyone is starting to wake up to, because of just the complexity and the magnitude of the problem, right? And he is technically light years ahead, because he was willing to work on something in his context that just felt you know unimaginable to sort of address. But it's the thing you wake up and you work on, and over time it really puts you ahead of the pack.
So how do you identify a valuable problem? Because I feel like maybe what people struggle with is identifying a problem that is valuable and knowing that it is going to be valuable, versus identifying a small problem and then wanting to make bank on solving a very small problem. How do you identify what problem is big or small?
No, that's good. I always say that, like, sometimes it's the intention that we set to solve a problem. So Elon would talk about how he would solve the problem, but he did not have the solution at the time, right? So sometimes it's acknowledging that the problems that we want to address, we don't have the solution. We don't even have a creative idea
Mm.
where to start. But we know fundamentally, if we're to talk about trade, if we're going to talk about e-commerce, if we're talking about building a new type of lifestyle brand that will transform the total middle class, the size of the task that you create for yourself
Mm-hmm.
is not necessarily a reflection of your current capacity. It is a reflection of your ambition, right? And then the job is to work on it every day. If you know how to solve the problem, then it's a project, right? We can give it a finite, timeline and say by this time you should finish. But your life's work
Mm.
is about continuous learning, and you literally, build a deeper understanding every day as you apply yourself, and over time, you gain clarity, and then innovation starts to show up, and then you're basically off to the races. So I would always say think about the magnitude, right? If it's something that you already feel like you can hack, then I can tell you that like it's not going to do too much for you, right? But if it's a problem that's existed over time and very few solutions exist, and you're making a commitment to move the needle over the next decade, I think that you now know in terms of size, you're in the right place. And then the second part is you just check. If you know what to do, then I guarantee you that's a small thing to do, right? If you don't know what to do and you're trying to organize yourself around the problem, then you know you have a job, and now you just have to show up every day at work and work on it.
Wow. Oh my gosh. That's good. That's so basically your vision has to be bigger if you want to have like a significant impact in what you end up, how big or how scalable your business can be. If you have a small, I guess, vision or intention, then you're saying that it's not really a problem that is very significant to solve, and people will most probably not be willing to buy it for however much that they can. So, um, what would you say to a person who they have those, but they also understand that funding is a big part of being able to actualize such a vision? So, for example, if someone wants to be like Elon, and have something like SpaceX, um, or is the acquiring of funding also connected to the to how big the vision is, or the ability to strategize around funding, is it connected to that? Because, or are they like at a roadblock if they have this vision for their company but they lack the resources to execute on that vision? What would you say to a person who is in that scenario? Should they quit, or should, like, how should they look at that?
Yeah. I mean, like I'm a very pragmatic person. Some people think I'm optimistic. I'm not optimistic. I'm a realist. I think that ambition is a muscle, right? You cannot start thinking about space
Mm.
if you cannot make $1,000 a month, right? I feel like that's more the dreaming part of it than the doing part of it. And for every entrepreneur, even as you work on something big, you have to validate your ability to build relevance, right? And so even as you think about like, hey, I would like to change the world in this regard, um, the process of changing the world is by also creating near end value, right? The people who will finance you or fund you will have to believe that you're capable. And you being capable means you have a track record or you're working on things that create value today, even as you work on the loftier side of what your ambition is. So I would always say if you're someone really starting out early and you're saying basically, I have no track record, I would say try to build sizable tasks, right? Um, I think that a product based business, I mean, out of Africa, we can get to $1 million in 3 years, 18 months to 3 years if it's a product based business. If a service based business, it could take 3 to 5 years because it's like it takes slightly different dynamics to scale a service, right? And to prove that stickiness with consumers. So, depending on your problem will give you sort of like a total addressable market, right? You then now have to show that you can create value. If we were to work on this theory of scaling to $1 million in 3 years, like if I came to you after 90 days and you started working on this thing within the constraints of your resources, you must show and demonstrate that you've created value that cannot be questioned, right? 6 months later, 1 year later, you've moved the needle in terms of outputs. So those micro wins will also give you the courage to go further in terms of what's possible, right? And if you don't have those, then it's very difficult for us to sort of project based on your trajectory that you will get to some of the loftier side of things. So I always believe that you stay true to what you believe. If you believe that you can change the world in a certain way, um, that's a declaration that you should always have. And then you begin to build milestones of how you begin to transform the spaces that you are in. Going back to that idea of listening, creating value for the people around you, gaining that validation. And over time, you begin to build momentum, whether it's networks, relationships, funding. It could be one or two ventures before your main venture. But at some point, you will sort of snowball into like pretty sizable transactions, and that's just how it works for everybody. So the balance is never to discount what is possible from where you stand, but be pragmatic about creating value in the present that positions you for greater opportunity.
Wow. Um, yeah, and I think you're right. You it's like the concept of the Bible where uh Jesus, when he met Moses, he asked him, "What do you have?" So you for you to be able to dream big, you have to make very good use of what you have and prove that you can build the big thing so that the people that you need the capital from can believe you. So I think what you're saying is you have to exercise your ambition by doing with what you have what you can to prove that you can do what you say you were gonna do. Like, okay, I imagine if maybe Elon hadn't built PayPal and Tesla and all these other companies, people would probably take him more of a fool than than a genius than they are right now, even though even with building those businesses and the credibility that he had built, they still considered him a little bit insane with this
Yeah.
space stuff. So um what would you say to a business that has already gotten through that hump, though? So they have validated their business, they know that there's a market for them, they are just unable to scale. um they don't know how to move from making 1 million maybe to making 5 million, because they have a product that is really a product or a service that is more transactional and um, they don't know where to find more people, I guess, to buy their product. They want to kind of leverage on their existing customers or something like that. Or what would you say are the fundamental principles of any business that is trying to scale? They've seen success, they know there's a market for what they do, but they're unable to scale that um, exponentially. What would be the biggest tip?
The first thing that I subscribe to as an idea is that when a business slows down growth, they are essentially losing relevance with their customers, right? Because it's either you're growing or dying. There's no in between, right? It's either I love the product or I'm starting to love it a little less. And the more and more I feel that way, the less and less I purchase. And so the instructive thing to think about is it an internal problem or is it an external problem, right? Because if it's an internal problem, then it means that we need to sort of rejig how we think, how we're approaching the issue. If we still have our structures and our KPIs and our OKRs functioning in a way that drives the business forward. And if you can reorganize and re sort of rejuvenate that part of the business, you will start to get traction again. If it's an external thing, then again, it goes back to that idea of listening to what the customer is saying. Because if you're not growing, it means customers don't love what you do, or there's a shift. The customer has moved, and you need to figure out where the customer is for growth to take place. It is unnatural for a business to be stagnant. That's not a natural environment. It's actually an indicator that something's about to go terribly wrong, right? So there is no comfort sort of in between. Sometimes what
Mm.
we find is we find ourselves in adjacent markets or niche markets, right? And sometimes you've hit the ceiling, and it means that it's time to pivot. It's time to growth means change, right? It means that if we serve a community that cannot continue to buy more, or we cannot innovate to build new products for them to consume, then we then say, how do we create larger market segments that allow us to be relevant? And oftentimes it starts that circle of what do customers need, you know, and what's in our capabilities to deliver that value. And if it's not in our capabilities, then can we learn that skill and then start to test that? And we will see sort of growth in revenue or growth in margins as an indicator that we're creating enough value for the customer and ourselves. But I always encourage uh, businesses to think of growth as the more natural thing. Anything that is any indication of slow growth, um, just based on principles of momentum. Once your momentum slows down, the cost to create traction becomes really high. So it means you need to recapitalize a business, whether with the human resource or operating costs or some type of shift. So never wait until things slow down. Ride on current momentum to really get you to the next place, and then you get the right level of cost efficiency.
Wow. That's a lot. I hope the people listening have gotten that, because you just gave people like a lot of value right there in terms of um if your business is not growing, it's declining. So, and it's cause for you to actually do something, right? And not just wait for maybe seasons to change. Because I think what I experience a lot is people giving justification for declines to exterior factors, like um like COVID was one. and a bunch of other things, maybe the weather, maybe policy, and all these things, and people wanting or waiting for those factors to change back to what they were for business to continue to being good. But what you're saying is any point where the momentum stops going from the natural upward trajectory, it's a cause for you to actually do something. Whether it, and most of that doing, like you said, is in the listening and trying to figure out um, what have the maybe intentions of the customer changed, or did have they evolved, or what are their needs, and then trying to innovate around that. So wow. So what would you say to a person who has heard you today and they want to see how you, whether it's you or the organizations that you're involved in, can help them with their businesses, whether they have a problem with scaling or they have a problem with actually even launching? um, what would you tell them? Where would you lead them to?
I think a good place to start is always create a community of like-minded people around you, right? Um, I think we sort of live in an age where you have lots of access to information. So maybe 50 years ago, information was the problem. Now there's too much information. And the challenge that most business owners have is they don't have accountability structures. They don't have a community that asks them, are you still being relevant? How are you doing, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually? Um, they find themselves sort of, ostracized from society. And that always translates into poor performance over the long term, right? So if you're a business owner, try to get people around you that are in business and have conversations, learn from each other. It's literally the most nourishing thing that you could do for yourself for you to perform. As you get bigger, sometimes you outgrow your peers, and it means you need to make new friends at that stage to also help you um, learn and share with others so that you continue to excel. The second part is if you are working on something and it's not working. So I advise entrepreneurs to work on the business in 90-day sprints, right? And you can't seem to get the traction up, first 90 days. By the time you get into the fourth month and you don't have results, find help, right? um, the idea of entrepreneurship is evolving to the point that you understand what is required. So the smart thing sometimes is to ask for help. The smart thing is to get a second opinion. It's not that you have to figure it out, right? You need to get to a place where you can identify that this is either above you or this is beyond you, and you start to identify who could solve that problem. And when you do that, you're the smart person in the room because you're making what I call a rational decision to create progress. The third thing that may be helpful is again looking for consulting companies. And I always find like African companies, um, because I'm in Africa in this context, you know, we sort of sometimes undervalue the knowledge component, and we trust that we can figure some stuff out. And I think sometimes it's an expensive bet, right? If you can figure it out, then give yourself that 90 days. If you haven't figured it out 6 months in, know that you're now wasting resources, right? And you need to think of consulting companies or branding companies or other knowledge service based companies as complementary assets to your scaling component. And when you start to engage with them, they will they won't stay on payroll if they're not doing the work. If they can't deliver the value, you'll cut them off like instantly, right? So there's no harm there, right? So it's not a long term commitment. It's sort of like a mutually beneficial transaction. And when you begin to surround yourself with knowledge partners, you are able to sort of grow. The moment you learn something that's instructive, you then bring it into the company um, as an internal function. So maybe you didn't know what marketing was, you started working with Joe, and Joe started to tell you about social media, and you learned a couple of things. You then say, okay, Joe, I've figured out social media and I've hired an intern. Can we talk about paid marketing, right? And so as you acquire knowledge, you sort of reinforce the development of the business by actually bringing those skills inside, right? And let your knowledge based partners support you with the more complex stuff that maybe is a first of its kind that you're trying to work on, and they then you would see the value that they bring to you. And I think over time, naturally, you'll sort of like benefit. So if you use sort of those um, maybe three rules, I think it'll keep you sane. And if you really, really need support, like from Tactive or any company like ours, I would say reach out, and we're happy to have a conversation. Our first conversation is never at a cost. We'll help you sort of do a high level diagnosis of what's going on and then make some recommendation. If it makes sense for both of us, then we'll sort of take on the work and work together on it.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, Kay. I think I will say for one, and I've listened to a lot of people, I have never heard anyone break down those three things that you've just broken down, which I think are amazingly helpful for anyone that is really trying to grow and scale their businesses. So thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate that. And I'm sure that the people watching this will really, really appreciate it. And if they feel stuck, like you said, if they've built a community, they've worked on whatever it is that they're working on for 90 days and they still feel like they can't get over the hump, that they'll be able to reach out and get the help. Um, Appreciate you. Thank you for coming through. Yeah, so I don't know if do you have any final thoughts or um, anything that you would like to share with the people? How
Great,
can they find you? Um, are you on
great.
social at all?
I am on LinkedIn. So it's my
Yeah,
full name's
yeah.
Kotsanai Matereke. You can find me on
Hmm.
LinkedIn, or you can email me at kaye at tactive.consulting. I think Joe, if you're happy to also share my details, I'm happy for people to
Yeah,
reach out, and
absolutely.
it will be just great to connect.
Yeah,
Maybe
absolutely.
a parting thought is that where we have seen the most fundamental progress in human evolution is when we've seen strong communities. And I think in a world that's very digital, more and more people feel very removed. And I think it's easy to feel sort of isolated in one form or the other. In order for you to build a great business, you need a great support system. So be part of a community, help someone who's trying to work on their problem as you work on yours, and that will create sort of a reinforcing effect on all of our ambitions. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We should do this again. I know you're very busy, but we'll see
No,
if
happy
people
to
like
do it.
this, and if they want another one, well, I'll have no choice but to
All
try
right,
and
great.
find you. Always a pleasure, Kate. Thank you.
Same here.